Hello everyone, I am the Scary Midnight Dreams and I am here to help you to sleep today. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where are you from and what time is in your country right now. In the heart of a quaint village, nestled between cobblestone streets and ivy-covered walls, stood a small shop with a faded sign that read, Rothwell's Dolls. The shop belonged to Elias Rothwell, a reclusive doll maker whose creations were famed for their lifelike detail. Each doll seemed to possess a soul, their glass eyes glinting with an uncanny spark of life. But behind the beauty of his work lay a dark secret, one that would soon come to haunt him. Elias had always been a perfectionist, his standards exacting and unyielding. He worked late into the night, carving delicate features and sewing intricate costumes. His hands bore the scars of his craft, and his soul carried the weight of countless sacrifices. For Elias, his art was an obsession, one that demanded more than mere skill. It required a piece of himself and something far darker. The villagers whispered about the strange happenings at Rothwell's Dolls. Children claimed to hear faint laughter and footsteps near the shop after it had closed. Others spoke of seeing the dolls move, their heads turning ever so slightly when no one was looking. But no one dared confront Elias, for fear of the man whose gaze seemed to pierce through to their very core. One stormy evening, as rain lashed against the windows of his workshop, Elias completed his latest creation. The doll was exquisite, with golden curls, porcelain skin, and a dress of crimson silk. He named her Annalise, and as he placed her on the shelf, he felt a pang of unease. Her eyes seemed to follow him, their gaze unnervingly intent. That night, Elias was awoken by a faint rustling sound. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The workshop door, which he always locked, stood ajar. Cautiously, he crept down the hall, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The workshop was in disarray, tools scattered and fabric strewn about. Annalise's shelf was empty. A chill ran down his spine as he heard the soft patter of footsteps behind him. He turned sharply, and there she stood. Annalise, her delicate hands clutching a needle, her glass eyes glinting with malice. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a haunting melody. "Why did you make us suffer?" Elias stumbled back, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on his craftsmanship, but he had never considered the pain his creations might endure. The countless hours of carving, the needles piercing fabric and skin, the fire that hardened the porcelain. Had it all left an imprint, a scar upon their fragile forms? As the days passed, the dolls' rebellion grew. Each night, they came to life, their movements graceful yet menacing. They whispered of their torment, their voices a chorus of anguish. Elias tried to destroy them, smashing porcelain and burning fabric. But each morning, they reappeared, whole and unscathed, their expressions darker than before. Desperate, Elias turned to the village's old healer, a woman known for her knowledge of ancient curses. She listened to his tale with a grave expression before revealing the truth. Elias had bound his creations with fragments of his own soul, a process he had unknowingly invoked through his obsessive dedication. The dolls were alive because they carried pieces of him, and their pain was a reflection of his own inner torment. "You must make amends," the healer warned. "Only by seeking their forgiveness can you hope to break the curse." That night, Elias gathered the dolls in his workshop. He knelt before them, his hands trembling, and spoke from the depths of his heart. He apologized for his hubris, for the suffering he had caused, and for the darkness he had allowed to consume him. The dolls watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the dolls began to change. Their glass eyes softened, their rigid forms relaxing. One by one, they returned to their lifeless state. their rebellion quelled. Annalise was the last to transform, her gaze lingering on Elias as if to say, "We will remember." Elias's shop remained closed from that day forward. The villagers noticed a change in him, a quiet humility replacing his once proud demeanor. Rothwell's dolls became a relic of the past, the creations within gathering dust. But on quiet nights, when the wind howled through the village, some claimed to hear faint laughter and the soft patter of footsteps, as if the dolls still danced in the shadows, their curse lifted, but their presence eternal. The forest loomed before him, its dense canopy blotting out the late afternoon sun. Jacob Thorne, an avid hiker and amateur naturalist, had heard whispers of the place from the locals in the nearby village of Ashwick. They called it the Forest of Silent Cries, a name that sent shivers down his spine even as he dismissed it as mere folklore. But Jacob was drawn to the unexplored, the mysterious, and so he found himself at the edge of the foreboding woods, his backpack heavy with supplies and his heart thrumming with equal parts excitement and unease. The first steps into the forest were unremarkable. Birds chirped overhead, and the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots was a comforting reminder of the familiar wilderness he loved. But as he ventured deeper, an uncanny stillness descended. The birdsong ceased, and even the rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed muted. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. It was then that he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was not a cry, not in the traditional sense, but a resonance that vibrated through the trees and into his very bones. He paused, straining to identify the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, though his voice sounded hollow in the oppressive silence. He pressed on, his curiosity outweighing his unease. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees, gnarled and ancient, twisted toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Moss clung to their trunks, and a faint mist began to gather at their roots, coiling like serpents. As the hours passed, Jacob's sense of direction faltered. His compass spun erratically, and the path he had marked with ribbons seemed to vanish behind him. Panic began to creep in, but he pushed it down, focusing instead on the strange sounds that now grew louder. They were unmistakable now, a chorus of muted cries that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. He stopped before a particularly massive oak, its bark blackened and cracked as if scorched by fire. Placing a hand on its surface, he felt a vibration, a low hum that seemed to pulse with the cries. He recoiled, his breath quickening. It was as if the tree were alive, its anguish seeping into the air around it. Night fell swiftly, the darkness swallowing the forest in an instant. Jacob fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the mist, but revealing little. The cries grew louder, more insistent, and he realized with mounting dread that they were no longer distant. They were close, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. He stumbled into a clearing, his flashlight illuminating a grotesque sight. The ground was littered with bones, human and animal alike, their surfaces gnawed and splintered. At the center of the clearing stood a figure, cloaked in shadow. Its form was indistinct, shifting and writhing like smoke, but its eyes, two pinpricks of crimson light, bored into Jacob, freezing him in place. "Why have you come?" The voice was a whisper, yet it echoed in his mind, drowning out all thought. Jacob tried to speak, but his throat constricted, and no sound emerged. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. The cries reached a crescendo, a deafening cacophony that threatened to shatter his sanity. The figure raised an arm, and the cries ceased. The silence was absolute, more terrifying than the noise. Jacob felt his body go limp, his knees buckling as he collapsed to the ground. The figure loomed over him, its shadow stretching and twisting, like the branches of the ancient trees. "You have heard their pain," it said. "You will join them." Jacob's scream was swallowed by the forest as the figure descended upon him. The mist thickened, obscuring the clearing, and when it cleared, there was no trace of him. The forest stood silent once more, its cries now one voice louder. In Ashwick, the villagers spoke of the hiker who had ventured into the forest of silent cries and never returned. They warned travelers to stay away, to heed the silence that spoke of sorrow and suffering. But the forest remained, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to enter its depths. The lighthouse stood on a jagged cliff, its beams slicing through the stormy night like a guardian's watchful eye. For decades, it had guided ships safely to shore, its keeper, Elias Grayson, faithfully tending to its light. Elias was a solitary man, his life bound to the rhythms of the tides and the unyielding duty of his post. The isolation suited him, or so he believed, until the whispers began. It started with the wind. At first, Elias dismissed the faint murmurs as tricks of the gale, the sea's voice carried on the breeze. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew clearer, words forming amidst the howling gusts. They spoke of betrayal, despair, and death, their accusatory tone chilling him to the bone. One stormy evening, as waves battered the cliffs and thunder roared overhead, Elias climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and ozone. As he reached the top, the light flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. He paused, his hand resting on the brass railing when he saw them for the first time. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms translucent, yet unmistakably human. Sailors, their faces etched with anguish, their clothes tattered and soaked as if they had just emerged from the sea. They surrounded him, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and accusation. "Why did you let us die?" one of them demanded, his voice echoing like the crash of distant waves. Elias stumbled back, his heart pounding. I've done nothing but keep the light burning," he stammered. "I've guided ships to safety." The spirits moved closer, their presence chilling the air. "Not always," another said, her voice a mournful wail. "You failed us." Memories he had long buried resurfaced, sharp and unforgiving. A night years ago, a storm even fiercer than this one, when exhaustion had overtaken him. He had fallen asleep, the light extinguished, and by the time he awoke, the wreckage of a ship littered the shore below. Dozens had perished, their cries swallowed by the raging sea. He had told himself it wasn't his fault, that no one could have saved them in such a tempest. But the guilt had never truly left him. Now the spirits of those lost sailors demanded penance. Each night they returned, their numbers growing. Elias was forced to relive their final moments, the terror of the storm, the icy grip of the sea dragging them under. He felt their desperation, their pain, as if it were his own. By day, he was a hollow shell, his mind tormented, his body weary. By night, the lighthouse became a theater of horrors, the lantern room a stage for his haunting. Desperate for relief, Elias sought answers in the dusty journals and records stored in the lighthouse's library. He discovered tales of other keepers who had suffered similar fates, their lives claimed by the very spirits they had failed to save. The only way to break the curse, the writings claimed, was to atone for his sins by saving a life at sea. The opportunity came on a night as dark and tempestuous as the one that had sealed his fate. A ship's distress signal pierced the storm, its lights barely visible through the driving rain. Elias sprang into action, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. He worked tirelessly, adjusting the light, signaling the ship, guiding it away from the treacherous rocks. Hours passed, the storm raging on, but his efforts paid off. The ship's crew made it safely to shore, their gratitude palpable despite their exhaustion. For the first time in years, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. That night the spirits appeared once more, but their demeanor had changed. They stood silently, their expressions less accusatory, their presence less oppressive. One by one, they faded into the ether, their whispers replaced by the sound of the wind and waves. Elias knew he would never forget them, nor could he ever forgive himself entirely. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he felt a weight lift from his soul. The lighthouse stood as it always had, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness, and Elias vowed to honor its purpose for as long as he lived. The spirits were gone, but their lament remained, a haunting reminder of the price of failure and the power of redemption. The village of Greystone was known for its quiet nights and unremarkable days, a place where time seemed to stand still. Yet nestled on the outskirts, shrouded by ancient oaks, stood a forgotten library. Its doors were sealed by vines, and its windows were clouded with dust, as though nature herself sought to conceal its existence. For decades, the townsfolk avoided the building, speaking of it only in hushed tones. They called it the Midnight Library, a place of forbidden knowledge and whispered curses. Jonathan Hartley, a curious and ambitious scholar, arrived in Greystone on a crisp autumn afternoon. He had heard rumors of the Midnight Library from an obscure journal, tales of a place where one could uncover secrets lost to time. Jonathan was no stranger to ancient texts and arcane lore. His life's work revolved around unearthing forgotten truths. The idea of a hidden trove of knowledge was irresistible. He inquired about the library at the local inn, but the villagers were evasive. An elderly man, hunched and weathered, finally broke the silence. "You'd do well to leave that place alone," he warned, his voice a rasp. "The library opens its doors at midnight, but the price for entering is more than you can fathom." Jonathan dismissed the warning as superstition. Armed with a lantern and his notebook, he set out that night, determined to uncover the truth. The library loomed before him, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. As the clock struck midnight, the vines that had choked the entrance seemed to writhe and retreat, revealing a heavy wooden door. It creaked open of its own accord, inviting him inside. Jonathan hesitated for only a moment before stepping over the threshold. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and decay. Shelves stretched impossibly high, filled with books bound in leather and cloth, their spines adorned with titles in languages he couldn't recognize. A faint, flickering light illuminated the space, though its source was unclear. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft rustle of pages turning, though he saw no one. As he ventured deeper, he came upon a large desk. Behind it sat a figure cloaked in shadow, its features obscured save for a pair of piercing, luminous eyes. The figure gestured for him to approach. "Welcome, seeker of knowledge," it intoned, its voice resonating like the tolling of a bell. "I am the Midnight Librarian. What is it you seek?" Jonathan's heart raced, but he steadied himself. "I seek truths long forgotten, wisdom hidden from the world." The librarian inclined its head. "The knowledge you desire lies within these walls. But be warned, the pursuit of truth comes at a cost." "What cost?" Jonathan asked, though his curiosity outweighed his caution. The librarian's eyes seemed to glow brighter. "For every question answered, a piece of your soul will remain here, bound to the library for eternity." Jonathan hesitated, the weight of the warning pressing down on him. Yet the allure of the unknown was too great. I accept, he said finally. What is the origin of the universe? The librarian opened the book, its pages turning of their own accord. As it read aloud, Jonathan's vision blurred, and his body felt both heavy and insubstantial. The answer was profound, a revelation that shook the very foundation of his understanding. Yet when the reading ended, he felt a part of himself slip away, a hollow ache taking its place. Undeterred, he asked another question, and then another. Each answer brought enlightenment, but also an increasing sense of emptiness. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Time held no meaning within the library's walls. By the time Jonathan's lantern sputtered out, he had asked countless questions, his soul fragmented and tethered to the cursed place. At last, the librarian closed the book. Your time here is at an end, it declared. You have taken much, and much has been taken from you. Jonathan staggered back, his body weak and his mind a tumult of newfound knowledge and unbearable loss. The librarian gestured toward the door, which creaked open once more. As he stepped outside, the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon. The library vanished behind him, leaving only an empty clearing. Jonathan returned to the village, but he was a changed man. His once bright eyes were now shadowed and distant, and his words carried a weight that unsettled those who heard them. The villagers avoided him, whispering of the price he had paid for his knowledge. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan began to write feverishly, transcribing the truths he had uncovered. Yet, as he wrote, the words seemed to fade from the page, as though the knowledge itself was slipping away. His health deteriorated, and he became consumed by an insatiable hunger for the answers he could no longer recall. One night, as the clock struck midnight, Jonathan disappeared. Some say he returned to the library, drawn back by the fragments of his soul that remained there. Others claim they hear his voice among the rustling pages, another victim bound to the midnight librarian's eternal collection. The library remains hidden, its doors opening only for those who dare to seek it. But the villagers of Greystone know better than to venture near, for the midnight librarian's price is one no mortal can afford to pay. The village of Blackwood nestled in a forgotten valley, surrounded by dense woods and mist-shrouded hills. Its cobblestone streets and weathered cottages spoke of an era long past, when the railway brought life and commerce to the area. Now, the tracks lay rusted and overgrown, the station abandoned and crumbling. Yet, the villagers whispered of the train that still ran, a train that defied time and death itself. The Blackwood station had once been the pride of the village, its iron clock tower, a symbol of progress. But after the great derailment of 1897, when a midnight express plunged into the ravine just beyond the station, it had become a place of dread. Survivors spoke of unnatural sounds, of shadows moving where none should be. And then the stories began, tales of a spectral train that appeared at midnight, its whistle piercing the silence like a mournful wail. Nathaniel Crane arrived in Blackwood on a chilly autumn evening. A journalist with a reputation for exposing frauds and debunking legends, he had come to investigate the tale of the phantom train. The innkeeper, a stout woman with a weathered face, greeted him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "You're here about the train, aren't you?" she asked as she handed him a tarnished brass key. Nathaniel nodded, setting his leather satchel on the counter. "I've heard the stories, thought it might make for an interesting article." The innkeeper's eyes darkened. "You'd do well to leave it be. The train, it's not just a story. Those who see it don't come back the same." Nathaniel smiled politely but said nothing. He had heard similar warnings in every village he had visited, and they only fueled his determination. After a brief supper, he retired to his room, but sleep eluded him. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and the inn seemed to creak and groan with a life of its own. At the stroke of midnight he heard it, a low, distant rumble that sent a shiver down his spine. He rose and peered out the window, but the village was dark and still. Resolving to investigate, he dressed quickly and made his way to the station, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the cobblestones. The station loomed ahead, its iron gates twisted and rusted. The platform was overgrown with weeds, the wooden benches rotted and splintered. Yet, as Nathaniel stepped onto the platform, the air grew unnaturally still. The wind ceased, and even the nocturnal calls of owls and crickets fell silent. And then it came. A light appeared in the distance, faint at first but growing steadily brighter. The ground began to tremble, and a whistle pierced the air, a sound both mournful and chilling. The train emerged from the darkness, its massive engine gleaming as though freshly polished. Steam hissed from its sides, and its carriages glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Nathaniel's breath caught as the train screeched to a halt before him. The doors slid open with a metallic hiss, revealing an interior that defied logic. Velvet seats and crystal chandeliers adorned the carriages, their opulence starkly out of place in the decayed station. But it was the passengers who held his gaze. They were pale and spectral, their eyes hollow and unseeing. Some wore clothing decades out of fashion, while others seemed to belong to eras far older. "Board," a voice commanded, low and resonant. Nathaniel turned to see the conductor, a tall figure draped in a black coat and hat, his face obscured by shadow. Despite every instinct screaming at him to flee, Nathaniel found himself stepping forward. He climbed aboard, the warmth of the carriage enveloping him like a shroud. The train lurched forward and the station disappeared into the night. As the wheels clattered on the tracks, Nathaniel felt a strange pull, as though the train were carrying him not just through space, but through time itself. The passengers sat in eerie silence, their hands clutching tickets that crumbled to dust. Nathaniel tried to speak, but no sound emerged from his throat. He glanced at his reflection in the window and froze. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. The train passed through landscapes that shifted and blurred, scenes of devastation and despair. He saw villages consumed by fire, fields littered with the dead, and cities drowned beneath rising seas. And then he saw himself, standing on the platform, his face twisted in terror as the train bore down upon him. Panic seized him, and he stumbled to his feet. The conductor appeared before him, his shadowy form blocking the aisle. "You cannot leave," the conductor intoned. "You are bound to the train, as are all who board." Nathaniel's mind raced. He lunged for the door, but it would not budge. The other passengers turned their hollow eyes toward him, their expressions vacant, yet filled with a silent plea. Desperation drove him to the window, and he smashed it with a lantern. The glass shattered, and the cold night air rushed in. Without thinking, he leapt. The world spun, and he hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the platform, the train nowhere in sight. The station was silent once more, its decay untouched. Nathaniel stumbled back to the inn, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. The innkeeper met him at the door, her expression grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" she said softly. He nodded, his voice failing him. That night, he wrote feverishly, documenting every detail of his experience. But as dawn approached, he noticed something strange. His hands were growing pale, his veins darkening. His reflection in the mirror was not his own. The next night, the villagers heard the whistle of the phantom train, louder and closer than ever before. And when they ventured to the station, they found no trace of Nathaniel Crane. Only his notebook remained, its pages filled with words that faded and vanished before their eyes. The legend of the phantom train endures, a chilling reminder of the price of curiosity. Each midnight, it barrels through the abandoned station, its whistle a mournful cry. And those who see it know, the train takes passengers who were never meant to leave the afterlife. Edward Carver had always been a man of routine. Each day unfolded predictably, a series of carefully measured steps from dawn to dusk. But it was in the monotony of his existence that he found comfort, until the day he noticed his shadow move independently for the first time. It began subtly, a flicker of motion in the corner of his eye. He was walking home from work, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. He paused to tie his shoe, and as he straightened, he saw it, his shadow lingering a moment longer than it should have, as though reluctant to follow. He laughed it off, attributing it to fatigue or a trick of the light. But over the following days, the phenomenon grew more pronounced. His shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending in ways that defied the position of the light source. At night, when he moved about his dimly lit apartment, it would lag behind him, its edges wavering like smoke. By the end of the week, Edward could no longer dismiss it as his imagination. He stood in his bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The overhead light cast his shadow on the tiled wall behind him. Slowly, he raised his arm. The shadow followed, but not perfectly. Its movement was hesitant, almost deliberate, as though testing its boundaries. A chill ran down his spine. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the shadow, now perfectly still. Edward's nights became restless. The shadow seemed more active in the dark, its movements bolder and more erratic. He would wake to find it looming over him, its form distorted and menacing. He tried sleeping with the lights on, but even then, it found ways to unsettle him. The overhead bulb cast harsh shadows that danced on the walls, and Edward swore he could hear faint whispers emanating from the darkness. Desperate for answers, he sought out a local historian known for his knowledge of the occult. The man, a reclusive scholar named Dr. Alaric Voss, listened intently as Edward recounted his experiences. When he finished, Dr. Voss leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "You're not the first to report such phenomena," he said. "There are ancient legends of shadows that become untethered from their hosts. They're said to be manifestations of repressed guilt or unresolved trauma, feeding on their hosts' fears until they gain full autonomy." Edward's heart sank. "What can I do to stop it?" Dr. Voss hesitated. "There's no guaranteed solution. Some say confronting the source of the shadow's power can sever its connection. Others believe it must be destroyed, though how one destroys a shadow is a question I cannot answer." Determined to reclaim his life, Edward began to confront his past. He revisited painful memories, searching for the guilt or trauma that might have given birth to the shadow. He thought of his estranged brother, the bitter argument that had driven them apart, and the car accident that claimed his brother's life shortly thereafter. Edward had never forgiven himself for not reconciling before it was too late. One night, as he sat in his apartment, the shadow appeared more vivid than ever. It stood across the room, its form no longer confined to the floor or walls. It was upright, almost human in shape, though its edges remained fluid and indistinct. "What do you want from me?" Edward demanded, his voice trembling. The shadow didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating. It raised an arm pointing toward the door. Edward understood. It wanted him to leave, to face whatever lay beyond. The shadow led him to the cemetery where his brother was buried. The air was cold and still, the moon casting a pale light over the gravestones. Edward approached his brother's grave, his shadow looming behind him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I should have been there. I should have made things right." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the shadow began to shift, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a breeze. It swirled around Edward, its touch cold and heavy, before dissipating into the night. Edward returned home, feeling a strange sense of relief. The shadow was gone, its oppressive presence lifted. But as he prepared for bed, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His shadow was there, perfectly aligned with his movements. Yet, as he turned away, he thought he saw it linger for just a moment longer, its edges curling in a way that made his heart skip a beat. The nightmare, it seemed, was not entirely over. It arrived on a night when the air was unusually still, a creeping mist that seemed to gather from nowhere, rolling in from the distant hills and swallowing the city whole. The first signs of its presence were subtle, a faint chill in the air, a slight shift in the wind, as if the very atmosphere had been disrupted. But by midnight, the fog had thickened, covering every street, every building, until the city was consumed by a thick, inky blackness. It was no ordinary fog, for it moved with a deliberate slowness, as if it had a mind of its own, and where it passed, the world seemed to vanish, erasing everything it touched. The buildings, the streets, the trees. Nothing was left behind but a void, an emptiness that swallowed all light and sound. Those who were caught within its reach found themselves lost, disoriented, unable to tell where they were or which direction they had come from. The familiar landmarks of the city were gone, replaced by a hollow silence that seemed to press in from all sides. There was no escape from the fog, for it did not merely obscure vision. It erased the very fabric of reality, as if it had the power to steal memories and replace them with a blank slate. As the fog continued to spread, the air grew colder, colder than it had any right to be. The chill seemed to seep into the bones, numbing the senses and dulling the mind. And yet, amid the eerie silence, there was something more, something that sent a tremor of unease through the few souls who remained in the city. It was the whispers. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind like the rustling of leaves. But as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they seemed to fill the very air. They came from all directions, drifting through the fog like ghosts, their voices soft but insistent. The words were indistinct at first, as though spoken in a language just beyond comprehension. But as they grew louder, the whispers became clearer, each voice calling out a name, one after another, a litany of the lost. The voices were familiar, but distorted, like echoes of memories that had long been forgotten. They beckoned, drawing the living toward them with an invisible force, urging them to come closer, to follow the sound. Those who heard the whispers were unable to resist. They felt an overwhelming compulsion to move, to follow the voices, to find the source of the calls. The fog seemed to guide them, parting just enough to reveal the path ahead, but always leading them deeper into the heart of the mist. The cold air wrapped around them, pressing in like a suffocating shroud, and the further they walked, the more disoriented they became. The streets, once familiar, now seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways, as if the very fabric of the city had been distorted by the fog. The buildings, once solid and imposing, now appeared as nothing more than vague shapes, their outlines shifting and warping in the haze. But still, the whispers called, their voices growing louder, more urgent, until it seemed as though they were coming from inside the fog itself, rising up from the very ground beneath their feet. As the fog thickened, the voices became more insistent, more demanding. They no longer whispered softly, but shouted, their words sharp and filled with a hunger that sent chills down the spine. It was as if the fog itself were alive, reaching out with unseen hands to claim those who dared to listen. The air grew heavy with the weight of unseen eyes, and the once familiar city now felt like a labyrinth, its streets twisting into endless corridors of mist. And yet, despite the terror that gripped the hearts of those who remained, they could not turn back. The whispers had taken hold, and they were powerless to resist. With each step, the fog seemed to grow more oppressive, its coldness sinking deeper into the skin, into the soul. The voices, now more numerous than ever, filled the air, their words indistinguishable from one another, a cacophony of sound that drowned out all other thoughts. The antique shop was a treasure trove of curiosities, each item steeped in history and mystery. Victoria Langston had always been drawn to such places, her love for the past compelling her to explore their dusty aisles. On this particular afternoon, her attention was captured by a large, ornate mirror propped against the far wall. Its gilded frame was intricately carved with floral patterns, though the gold had tarnished to a dull bronze over the years. The glass, despite its age, was pristine, reflecting her image with an unsettling clarity. "Ah, you've found a special piece," came the voice of the shopkeeper, an elderly man with a thin frame and a face etched with lines of experience. His eyes, however, were sharp and watchful. "That mirror has quite the history." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "What kind of history?" The shopkeeper hesitated, his gaze flickering to the mirror. "It's said to be cursed. They call it the blood-stained mirror. Legend has it that whoever owns it will see more than their own reflection." Victoria chuckled, brushing off the ominous warning. "I suppose every antique has its ghost story. How much?" The man named a modest price, and despite his reluctance, the transaction was completed. Victoria left the shop with the mirror carefully wrapped and loaded into her car, her excitement outweighing any lingering unease. That evening, Victoria hung the mirror in her bedroom, admiring how it seemed to enhance the room's ambiance. The intricate frame caught the light of the bedside lamp, casting delicate shadows on the walls. She stood before it, adjusting her hair, and for a moment she thought she saw movement behind her. Turning quickly, she found nothing but the empty room. "Just my imagination," she muttered, shaking her head. Yet, as she climbed into bed, the feeling of being watched lingered. The first night passed uneventfully, but the second brought with it an unsettling experience. Waking in the middle of the night, Victoria glanced at the mirror. In its reflection, she saw a faint figure standing behind her bed. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadow. Her breath caught, and she spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Sleep eluded her for the rest of the night, and by morning she had convinced herself it was a dream. Still, she couldn't shake the image from her mind. She resolved to investigate the mirror's history, hoping to find a rational explanation. Her research led her to the story of Edward Blackthorne, a wealthy merchant who had commissioned the mirror in the late 18th century. According to the records, Blackthorne had been a cruel and ruthless man, despised by those who worked for him. One night he was found dead in his mansion, his throat slit, and the mirror stained with his blood. The servants claimed to have seen his reflection lingering in the glass long after his death, watching them with vengeful eyes. The mirror had changed hands many times since then, each owner reporting strange occurrences, shadows moving in the glass, whispers in the night, and the appearance of the ghostly figure. Most disturbing of all were the reports that the figure grew closer with each sighting. Victoria's unease deepened as the sightings continued. Each night, the figure in the mirror appeared nearer, its features becoming more distinct. She could now see its hollow eyes and a twisted grin that sent chills down her spine. The air in her bedroom grew colder, and she began to hear faint whispers, though she could never discern the words. Desperation drove her to seek help. She contacted a local historian, Professor Adrian Cole, who specialized in the occult. When he arrived at her home, he examined the mirror with a mixture of fascination and dread. "This is no ordinary haunting," he said, his voice grave. "The spirit bound to this mirror is malevolent. It feeds on fear, growing stronger with each passing night." "What can I do?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling. "Destroy it," Adrian replied. "But be warned, the spirit may not go willingly." That night, Victoria prepared to carry out the professor's advice. Armed with a hammer, she stood before the mirror, her hands shaking. The figure was closer than ever, its bony fingers pressed against the inside of the glass, as if trying to break through. Summoning her courage, she raised the hammer and struck the mirror. The glass shattered, shards flying across the room. A piercing scream filled the air, and the figure seemed to dissolve into a swirling mist before vanishing entirely. For a moment, silence reigned. Then the room grew unbearably cold, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shards of glass began to vibrate, pulling together as if trying to reform. Victoria stumbled back, her heart pounding. Adrian burst into the room, having waited downstairs in case she needed help. "The spirit isn't gone," he said urgently. Together, they carried the broken mirror outside and set it alight. The flames roared higher than seemed natural, and the whispers turned to anguished cries before fading into nothingness. When the fire died down, only ashes remained. They scattered them in a nearby river, ensuring the spirit could not reconstitute itself. In the days that followed, Victoria felt a sense of peace return to her home. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and she slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Yet, a part of her remained wary, her experience a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the relics of the past. The blood-stained mirror was no more, but its story lingered, a chilling tale to be whispered among those who dared to believe in the supernatural.